Welcome, everyone. We're going to let folks join the room. Welcome, everyone. We'll just give a minute for folks to join the call today. Okay, it's 12:31 and we have a lot to cover in today's webinar, so we're going to get started. Again, welcome everyone to this webinar that is hosted by the West Coast Climate and Materials Management Forum in partnership with the Carbon Leadership Forum, New Buildings Institute, and RMI. I am Joy Onash with ERG, a contractor supporting the work of the forum, and I will be moderating the webinar today. The focus of today's webinar is including embodied carbon in climate action plans, and thanks everyone for joining us. Next slide. We'll first review some housekeeping items to ensure everything runs smoothly. For closed captioning of today's discussion, please select the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your screen. All participants are in listen-only mode currently. Please email julia.keen@erg.com if you experience any technical difficulties with Zoom. Please submit questions or items for discussion to the Q&A. And today's session will be recorded and shared at a later date on the forum website. Next slide. This forum includes this disclaimer at the start of each webinar to ensure participants understand the goals and parameters of the forum. Please note that the opinions, ideas, or data presented by speakers in this series do not represent forum members' policy or constitute endorsement by the forum. Next slide. And here's a quick look at today's agenda. First, we'll hear about the importance of embodied carbon. We'll learn about examples of tools for estimating a jurisdiction's embodied carbon emissions, as well as examples and resources for identifying embodied carbon reduction strategies. At the end of the presentations, we hope to have time for a brief question and answer period. During the presentations, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A to be addressed at the end. If there's not time to address all the questions, we hope to be able to follow up with you after the webinar. Next slide. Here's a brief overview of the forum in case you're not familiar. The forum is a collaboration of state, local, and tribal governments with the mission to develop ways to institutionalize sustainable materials management practices and to develop tools to help jurisdictions reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with materials. Next slide. And this slide shows a list of resources available on the forum website. Our intent is to have you go to the website and check them out and check back there regularly for updated information as we post upcoming webinars, as well as recordings there for you to check out. Next slide. Here you'll see an overview of the current areas of focus of the forum, which have taken shape into 4 work groups. And today's webinar is hosted by the Built Environment Work Group. Each of these work groups do seek to provide timely information as contexts are rapidly changing. And one key current development is the Inflation Reduction Act funding that you may already be familiar with. But this slide shows the various pools of funding that are targeting embodied carbon reductions. They include $350 million to EPA for increasing data availability and transparency through environmental product declarations and creating a labeling system for embodied carbon. Also about $2 billion each to General Services Agency and Federal Highway Administration to fund purchasing of lower carbon materials to stimulate market demand. Next slide. EPA's $350 million will provide grants, technical assistance, and labeling to reduce embodied carbon. The program is focusing on embodied carbon materials purchased by the federal government, such as steel, concrete, asphalt, and glass, and will impact over $4 billion in federal purchasing. Because reuse avoids upstream emissions, EPA has made an interim determination to include minimally processed, salvaged, and reused materials. These programs are under development, and EPA recently conducted a request for information, which received over 200 comments. These are publicly accessible, and you can also find new General Services Administration low embodied carbon requirements, and FAQs online. The forum will provide updates as this program develops. Next slide. Also part of the Inflation Reduction Act, and specifically related to today's topic of including embodied carbon in climate action plans, is EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grant. This has two phases. The first is a planning grant that's starting now. Later this year, EPA will make the remaining $4.6 billion in competitive implementation grant funding available to support the implementation of the priority climate action plans by state and local governments. Next slide. The planning grant is non-competitive, and 46 states and 79 metropolitan regions have opted in. Participating states are each receiving $3 million, and major metropolitan area lead agencies are receiving $1 million each to develop or expand climate action plans. Territories and tribes will also receive grants to develop climate action plans, often for the first time. If you don't know the state agency responsible for the grant in your state, or if you don't know if you're in a participating metro region, you can look up the list on the EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grant website, and we will briefly show those that are on the West Coast towards the end of our presentations today. We encourage you to get to know who is leading this effort in your area. We will also post the link where you can look up the organizations across the nation. Next slide. The first deliverable for these planning grants will be a priority climate action plan due in March of 2024. Projects that are included as strategies within these priority climate action plans would then be eligible for the competitive $4.6 billion of implementation funds. The grant guidance encourages agencies to adopt and implement ambitious policies and programs to reduce emissions and accelerate decarbonization across multiple sectors, including waste and materials management and commercial and residential buildings. The Built Environment Work Group has identified this as an unprecedented opportunity for regions and states to consider coordinated embodied carbon initiatives. Next slide. Based on the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant guidelines, the priority climate action plans have to follow a certain recipe. For embodied carbon to make it into these priority climate action plans, they should follow these steps. The same steps used to include building energy usage and transportation types of strategies. Our speakers today will be addressing these steps. First is the sector's emissions must be inventoried as the baseline condition, and our speaker Jordan will be speaking on that. The next step is identifying the right strategies, and our speaker Rebecca will provide real examples of these. Thirdly, the impacts of these strategies must be estimated. And finally, and most importantly, implementation, which is the whole reason for the planning process. So on our next slide, I will introduce our speakers today that you will be hearing from next. We have four speakers lined up for you. First, we have Jordan Palmieri from the Carbon Leadership Forum. Next up will be Rebecca Isau from RMI, then Megan Kalsman from the Carbon Leadership Forum, and Webley Bowles with the New Buildings Institute. And with that, we will turn it over to Jordan.
Hi there, Joy. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to partner with all these great organizations for this webinar series. My name is Jordan Palmieri. I'm a senior researcher at the Carbon Leadership Forum. I'm also joined by my colleague Megan Kalsman today, who will be speaking a little bit later in the webinar. We are a program based out of the University of Washington College of Built Environments. We've been doing this work since 2010, and our mission is to eliminate embodied carbon of buildings, materials, and infrastructure to create a just and thriving future. Along the bottom there are some of the projects that we're working on. Just to give you a taste of some of the resources we provide. We just published a material baseline report about a month and a half ago, which gives a snapshot of all the environmental product declarations in about 70 different product categories across North America. We're working on a whole building benchmark study, which gathers life cycle assessment results from a number of different building types across the country to establish a benchmark against which you can make comparisons. We're doing a lot of research right now on novel carbon storing building materials and spending plenty of time on PCR committees and other standards committees. If you are working in the policy arena, please do check out our policy toolkit on our website. There's a lot of resources for you there. And then finally, we do have plenty of volunteer opportunities for local hubs, where local hubs get together all across the world and mostly focused in North America to share embodied carbon reduction strategies within your community. So check out our website for more information. Okay, so that is the organization, and all of the other partners will introduce their organizations as they speak later. So if we could go on to the next slide, we'll jump right into the content. So we're going to cover how to incorporate embodied carbon into climate action plans today. Next slide, please. Here's what we will cover. I'll talk about a basic definition of embodied carbon, how we're starting to see it show up in different greenhouse gas emissions inventories, and then my colleagues will cover the last three there and give you examples of how they are being realized in North America today. Okay, next slide. Embodied carbon refers to the greenhouse gas emissions from the manufacture, transport, installation, maintenance, and disposal and/or recovery of construction materials. Next slide, please. We want to look at this visually. All of the emissions in the gold color here are emissions that contribute to embodied carbon. Anything from harvesting raw materials, transporting those materials to a factory, actually manufacturing the materials, the emissions from the construction equipment and constructing buildings and/or infrastructure. All of these emissions contribute to embodied carbon. We're increasingly spending more and more time focusing on the embodied carbon emissions because they're starting to show up in our greenhouse gas inventories as large sectors to abate. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to spend some time looking at greenhouse gas inventories at the global level, the state level, the local level, and then a little bit at the agency level to give you all an idea of how embodied carbon is being identified in today's GHG inventories. Next slide, please. So let's start at the global level. Here's global greenhouse gas emissions by end use. Again, if you kind of hone in here on the gold color, we'll see industry is a really big slice of the pie. In fact, it is the largest slice of the pie at a global level. Producing iron and steel, cement and concrete, other plastics, all of these industrial emissions contribute greatly to global emissions. And many of these materials produced through industry end up finding their way into buildings and infrastructure. So when we're talking about reducing embodied carbon, we're talking about using fewer materials. We're talking about reusing materials. We're talking about purchasing more efficiently produced materials. These are all strategies to decarbonize the industrial sector. And it's really important that we decarbonize the industrial sector because we all know that over the next 7 years, we need to take every single slice of this pie, including the industry slice, and cut it in half by about 50%, and then down to zero by 2050. So that's how we're starting to see embodied carbon at the global level. Next slide, please. If we come down to the state level, I want to use the state of Oregon's consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions as an example. In Oregon, we see that about 28% of all consumption-based GHG emissions are from the building sector, both operating buildings and producing materials to construct those buildings. Let's go into a little bit more detail on these emissions from Oregon in the next slide. Here we can see the building sector broke up into different both residential and commercial buildings. Starting from the bottom, moving up, the biggest contributor to emissions in both residential and commercial buildings in Oregon is the consumption of electricity. The next largest sector of emissions is the consumption of materials. So a lot of times we're not seeing charts that show both the operational carbon emissions and the embodied carbon emissions in one chart. For Oregon, we are. And in this case, this also helps you figure out how to spend your time, right? So if I looked at this chart and I'm working on commercial buildings, I'd be spending at least 25% of my time and focusing on reducing the embodied carbon of materials, because we see that materials in both the commercial and residential sector contributes about 25% of all the building sector emissions in any given year. So that's the state level. Let's work down to the city level on the next slide and talk about the city of Portland. Here's a tree map of City of Portland's consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions by subcategory. If you move on to the next slide, the thing that I want to focus on here, thank you, is just the building sector emissions. Now, if you notice here, these building material emissions are actually quite large compared to the building energy emissions. And it turns out that when you're just looking at the building sector within the city of Portland, Oregon, building materials themselves contribute up to 45% of total emissions. And the energy used in buildings only contributes 55%. So again, this is a way to think about not only identifying where your impacts occur, but how to spend your time and resources. Within the built environment sector, I'd be spending 45% of my time on reducing the impacts of building materials here. And so as someone who lives in the city of Portland, my educated guess on why we're seeing building materials contribute more to emissions than we did, let's say, at the state level is for a couple of reasons. One, there's a lot of construction happening in the city of Portland, and overall, a lot of materials are being consumed. And then two, we also see there's a lot of programs to address energy efficiency in existing buildings, both residential and commercial, and a lot of good work happening through rating systems where newly constructed buildings are meeting well above code targets for energy efficiency. So as the efficiency of our buildings increases, the relative impact of materials becomes greater and greater. All right, let's go to the next slide. For the state and the local level, I've been talking a lot about greenhouse gas inventories, specifically consumption-based greenhouse gas inventories. I am not going to go into the nitty-gritty detail of the difference between a production-based inventory and the consumption-based inventory, mainly because there was a great webinar just last month here hosted by the West Coast Climate and Materials Management Forum that went into a lot of detail about these two different inventories. The basics are that you will have the most opportunity for identifying reduction strategies if you do both inventories. They're complementary of one another. And certainly, if you want to see the impacts of building materials that are being consumed, you're going to need to do a consumption-based emissions inventory. And you're most likely going to need to hire this out, like many jurisdictions hire consultants to do GHG inventories. This will most likely be something that you also need to hire out for consumption-based emissions inventories. There aren't any really free tools out there at the moment to do this. There's some hopeful things that I learned about through last month's webinar happening in Europe right now that maybe we'll see a little bit more in the States. There's a tool being developed by the EPA for the state level, but not right now for the local level. But again, go to the last month's webinar if you want to learn more details about these different inventories. Okay. I think I'm going to move on to the next slide here. However, if you do not have a statewide consumption-based emissions inventory, one of the great things that's happening is we're starting to see very similar patterns with these consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions inventory and also more useful generic data being produced. If you go to the next slide, this is the chart that I pulled from King County, Washington's GHG inventory, consumption-based GHG inventory. And in there, they also did a greenhouse gas inventory of the US average household so that they can compare King County, Washington residents to the US average. I thought this was really helpful because showing the US average data gives anybody an opportunity to point to information like this and say, look, housing matters. And in the case of household emissions, let's say you're doing a community-based inventory and didn't have an opportunity to do a consumption-based approach, you could potentially point to something like this and say, we know that housing matters and that on average, the production of materials for the provision of housing contributes about 35% of all emissions are from producing the materials to provide that housing. About 65% are from the energy used to heat and cool those houses. So there are some resources out there that you could point to if you're not able to do a full consumption-based emissions inventory yourself. All right, next slide, please. Wrapping up here, I do want to point out that there's many people in the audience that are from either state or local government, and you may be doing greenhouse gas emissions inventories of your organization, your agency, your corporation, your entity. And in that case, these types of inventories are largely referred to as scope 1, 2, and 3 inventories. Building materials, the purchase and consumption of building materials are going to show up in your scope 3 emissions. I'm going to give two examples from two different agencies in the next two slides of how we see this happening. This next slide shows work that we just completed in April for Washington State Department of Transportation. So this is an agency-focused GHG inventory, and you can see here that over the last 5 years, Scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions from purchasing materials and services, those emissions are really dominating Washington State's inventory. And over a 5-year average, we see, again, those Scope 3 emissions from purchasing building materials dominate the GHG inventory of the State Department of Transportation. This really helps them not only establish a baseline of where they're starting, but also helps them focus their strategies on the sectors that matter most. Next slide, please. This is another GHG inventory, Scope 1, 2, and 3 of the Oregon Department of Transportation. Here you see an even more dominant pattern where the Scope 3 emissions of purchasing materials make up about 70% of the emissions, which is an even wider spread compared to WSDOT. One of the reasons we see this is that the Washington Department of Transportation runs a really large ferry system, right? And their ferry system uses a lot of fuel that ends up showing up in Scope 1 emissions. Oregon DOT does not run a ferry system. And so because their Scope 1 emissions are a little bit smaller, the relative impact of their Scope 3 is a little bit bigger. So this is how you can do this at an agency level. This is a little bit more of a bottom-up approach versus a top-down approach, like some of the community inventories. So to wrap up here, the point is whether you're doing a community-based GHG inventory or a GHG inventory at an agency level, you're going to see embodied carbon show up in these inventories. And then my co-speakers here are going to start to cover different strategies, how to reduce these emissions and identify the reduction potential. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca at RMI.
Thank you so much, Jordan. That was such an excellent presentation. And hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Esau. I'm a manager with RMI's Carbon-Free Buildings program, where I lead our embodied carbon policy research. Next slide, please. So RMI is a very large clean energy nonprofit, but I thought I would just give a quick overview of my small team's work at RMI to help orient you to what we do. At the federal level, we've helped develop GSA's Buy Clean guidance and roadmap to path to reach net zero embodied carbon by 2040 for all federal building projects. At the state level, we helped Colorado pass and implement Buy Clean legislation. We're currently participating in the technical advisory group for New York State's low carbon concrete procurement policy. We conducted research for both New York State and Massachusetts on Buy Clean and low carbon concrete bills. And we're also engaging in state DOTs across the US on low carbon concrete procurement. We've also had a hand in creating a new amendment for California's Green Building Code, which includes embodied carbon provisions. And then at the local level, we've hosted workshops to help cities integrate embodied carbon into climate action plans, which of course we're talking about today. So that gives you an overview of just our general policy work at the federal, state, and local or city levels. And if you have any questions as you embark on looking at climate action plans and how to integrate embodied carbon, please don't hesitate to reach out. Next slide. So let's look at how you might start integrating embodied carbon into climate action plans. Embodied carbon typically falls into the following climate action plan topic areas: either local production or industry, buildings or construction, waste or material recovery, and consumption emissions, or a combination of all four of those topics. The table on the slide highlights 7 different cities that have included embodied carbon in their climate action plans, and the topic or strategy area where those embodied carbon strategies fall. So you'll see examples in building and construction, consumption emissions, materials, and industrial emissions. Next slide, please. And setting an overall embodied carbon reduction target is a really important commitment and a step towards measuring progress as those strategies are put into action. There are target setting guidelines from C40 and Architecture 2030 to model from. These include a 50% reduction by 2030 goal for C40's Clean Construction Declaration and a zero global warming potential by 2040 goal for Architecture 2030's embodied carbon targets. The table on the right of the slide shows examples of reduction targets described in 4 different cities' climate action plans. And you'll see that some describe reduction from a particular baseline and some do not, but all of them set these clear time-bound goals for reduction. Next slide, please. Now, once you start thinking about how to reduce emissions, you will find a really broad set of strategies targeting different stages across a building or materials life cycle. So this diagram, it's not meant to overwhelm you. Really, the top of this diagram, you'll see the total embodied carbon emissions distribution of a typical building across the life cycle stages. So it's really important to remember here, this does not include operational carbon expended while heating, cooling, lighting the building, etc. This is really only looking at embodied carbon. And notice that almost 65 to 80% of embodied carbon emissions occurs at this product stage, which is on the very far left side of the screen. So this would be emissions from manufacturing products like steel, concrete insulation, other materials that are used to construct a building. And the policy strategies that directly impact this life cycle stage are policies that look at reducing emissions from manufacturing of building materials. An example is Buy Clean policy, or policies that look at material efficiency or how thoughtfully a material is used. Really, anything that's targeting this A1 to 3 life cycle stage or upfront emissions product stage will have large emission savings. So it could be a really good place to start if you are starting fresh. However, I don't want to dismiss other strategies that are listed here because they can have lots of great impact too. If you're looking at the end of life stage where you're thinking about deconstruction or material recycling, or the use and maintenance stage where you're thinking about building preservation or adaptation, all of those strategies help reduce newly produced materials and will have an indirect but significant impact on those upfront product stage emissions, as well as the emissions associated with the use stage and end of life stage. Also, these policies have lots of other amazing benefits to consider as well that could be a huge priority to you, like promoting circular and local economies or preserving historic places. So understanding the benefits to these strategies can help you navigate this landscape and choose which policies are going to be right for your city or municipality. Next slide, please. These are examples that are pulled from real climate action plans. So they show strategies identified in climate action plans that are incorporating embodied carbon reduction goals and targets. So you'll see that strategies fall under the categories of buildings. So you have lots of strategies that look at using municipal buildings to lead by example, or considering embodied carbon regulation through building codes. Or maybe under the category of material recovery and reuse, you have deconstruction requirements or waste diversion requirements. And under low carbon materials, maybe it's about procuring low carbon materials or supporting local producers. There are also strategies that kind of span across these topics that are also really important. increasing education around embodied carbon across the board, so important right now. Incentive programs that encourage reductions, and aligning existing and new policies that directly address or are adjacent to embodied carbon emissions, we've seen as a popular strategy that's included in climate action plans. Next slide. So here I did want to point out an important resource developed by the CNCA that presents 52 different policy options for cities to reduce embodied carbon. This is it's pretty dense. It's basically almost encyclopedic resource that shows the full range of embodied carbon policy options. These policies are divided into topic areas and ranked based on their carbon reduction impact. So I did pull this heat matrix thing from the report to show how much impact you can have by focusing, you'll see, on zoning and land use alone, for example, or regulation or infrastructure. So as you build out your list of reduction strategies to include under the different categories of your climate action plan, you can reference this report to understand impact and implementation factors, or you could also use this report to get inspired about new policies that you maybe never thought of as addressing embodied carbon before. And next slide. This is my last slide. I did want to show a quick case study from Austin's climate action plan. Austin released this climate action plan in 2021. They've set a 2030 target to achieve 40% reduction in embodied carbon in local construction from a 2020 baseline. And the strategies they've listed to achieve this goal include leading by example with municipal buildings. So here they will be encouraging low carbon building materials, doing whole building life cycle assessments, and achieving healthy building certifications, and building reuse for all city-owned projects. They will also be providing incentives to the public sector. So this includes expedited permitting. And the intention here would be to transition the guidance in these incentives ultimately over time to mandatory requirements for all buildings. They're also providing education for industry professionals and the generic or general public, with a focus on low-income communities and communities of color, and also a focus on the health impacts of materials. And they will be prioritizing partnerships with local material markets to really create that equitable and local material manufacturing and reuse economies. I thought that this climate action plan is really thoughtful, a really wonderful example of addressing embodied carbon from all different angles. So I would really encourage you all to check it out if you haven't yet already. And next slide. With that, I want to thank you for attending today, and I will pass it on to Megan.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. I'm Megan Kalsman. I am a policy researcher with the Carbon Leadership Forum, and I actually have a few more examples I'm going to dive into today around embodied carbon and climate action plans, starting with the Pacific Coast Collaborative. This is a coalition of regional governments on the West Coast. You can see here from British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, all the way down to California, including major cities that are highlighted. Next slide. So this, the Pacific Coast Collaborative works on climate change issues that you can see here, lots of different initiatives like transportation, clean energy, food waste. But today I'm going to talk about the low carbon construction initiative and some case studies in the next slide that we worked with them just a few months ago that we published. So we actually got to interview the jurisdictions to find out the process, development, what were some challenges and barriers, and what were some key success stories. Highlighting in these case studies, there's a link and it's on our website. Definitely encourage to check it out. Next slide, please. So these are the different categories of actions that we described in our case studies. Planned actions, so this is climate action plans. We also looked at government procurement. You've heard by clean a lot mentioned, zoning and permitting, building codes and bylaws, and reuse and deconstruction. But today I'm going to talk about the planned actions. And in the next slide, first, we're going to look at Oakland's 2030 Equitable Climate Action Plan. This one was really interesting to me because they called out specific goals related to embodied carbon. So they have a goal of gradually adopting more robust requirements for building materials with lower embodied carbon. They actually called out 4 specific materials: concrete, asphalt, steel, and lumber. Additionally, reducing waste by stimulating the local repair and reuse economy. They call out building codes and construction practices as an important goal in this climate action plan, as well as reducing overall scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. And so Rebecca described the different categories that we've seen across different climate action plans. And this one specifically, you heard just now about base codes and regulations. They actually called out they want to adopt the concrete code for new construction that's limiting embodied carbon emissions. I've mentioned supporting reuse and repair and recovery economy and city procurement. So they're really looking within their own city to track GHG emissions related to construction, building maintenance, travel, and food. So not only building materials, but other items as well. Next slide. And so we heard a few items of keys to success. Really, one was pairing the embodied carbon planned actions in the climate action plan with broader economic, workforce development, climate mitigation, and health actions. In the development of this climate action plan, collaboration with other local governments was super important to actually make sure that we have the material providers for these low carbon materials and a workforce that's ready to use these materials, that's trained. And they also actually called out that another key to success was the focus on low carbon concrete and embodied carbon generally in the climate action plan. That was actually took place in years before of existing work and awareness in Oakland. And I just want to call out here the Bay Area Low Carbon Concrete Code Stop Waste participated in Oakland, and it was actually a group funded by the Bay Area Air Quality Management District in 2018 from a grant. So it just goes to show the years of work that is going into these climate action plan developments. Next slide, please. So looking at the San Francisco Climate Action Plan, this one was actually developed in 2021. And they actually set a few targets. You can see here, achieve total carbon balance across the building sector and infrastructure sector. By 2030, buildings constructed will have a 40% reduction in embodied carbon. And in the next slide, we can go a little bit more into the categories and strategies. So here they outline policy instruments as a key way. So develop a suite of incentives, policies, and/or guidelines for adaptive reuse, as well as looking at procurement. They look at specific materials to amend existing policies to actually require deconstruction of buildings instead of demolition. They have a policy framework to expand and cultivate building material reuse markets, supporting workforce development, supporting small business enterprises. And actually education was a big piece as well that I noticed in this climate action plan, where they want to advance the best practices for design for disassembly and looking at buildings as material banks. So really looking at the circular economy viewpoint. Next slide. And so I just wanted to show here, I'm not going to read through all of them today, but I just wanted to call out that in San Francisco's responsible production and consumption section, they actually list a bunch of supporting actions with timelines. So some you can see here, by 2025, establish a maximum allowance for embodied carbon of buildings. By 2030, advancing best practices for design for disassembly, creating partnerships and implementation resources. So I really like this one where it calls out specific supporting actions with a timeline. Next slide, please. And so when we talked to the city of San Francisco, we heard that some keys to success was community participation from the beginning. So they were doing public engagement sessions, webinars, in person, online, to encourage community participation, which was really key. And similar to the Oakland Emergency Climate Action Plan, the San Francisco plan actually highlights the community benefits of low carbon construction, calling out how this contributes to a just transition and resilience. And I'll also mention that they have an equity metric to track data to their responsible production and consumption section that was just in the previous slide. So yeah, identifying EJ communities, identifying materials that nonprofits and small businesses are receiving. So wanted to point that out as well. Next slide, please. Thanks. And so my last one I'm going to talk about is Portland, Oregon. This actually came out in 2015. And they had a target here to have an 80% reduction goal by 2050. And actually, I'll just mention Portland has been coming out with climate action plans long before this, and they actually have progress reports on how the city's doing, which are published, made available for everyone to see, which is awesome. And in the next slide, we're going to dive into a little bit more about the strategies that they identified. So in Portland, around consumption and solid waste, they called out they want to reduce consumption-related emissions by encouraging sustainable consumption and supporting Portland businesses and minimizing the carbon intensity of their supply chains. Additionally, they want to provide technical assistance and resources to contractors to meet their construction and demolition requirements, promote alternatives to building demolition, which I'll go into a little bit more later, and really looking at rehabilitation, adaptive reuse. So they set these strategies in their climate action plan in 2015. And in the next slide, you can see a policy that came directly from it. So this is the Portland Deconstruction of Buildings Law. This came into effect in 2016. And I won't go into the details of the law, but I just wanted to mention how the climate action plan set it up for this policy to be passed. And in the next slide, you can see, this is a chart on the right, where you can see how many pounds were salvaged from an average home. You can see softwood lumber was a huge amount. It really stands out. And so, yeah, they're doing qualitative analysis, quantitative analysis for the policy itself. And next slide, please. So you can read a little bit more about this in our case study with the Pacific Coast Collaborative, but I just have a few timeline about how it started and some of the stakeholders that they worked with. So yeah, the work really began in 2015. They were doing modeling scenarios, looking at deconstruction versus demolition. They had stakeholder advisory groups with a whole list of stakeholders you can see on the side, on the right side of the screen. And it really was a phase-in approach until it became law in 2016. And that was actually the first city in the US to require a deconstruction and material salvage for its oldest and most historic houses. Next slide. So with all those examples and also many more on our policy tracker, I will encourage you to go on our website to check that out. How do we measure? How do we see the emissions that we're reducing? Well, we published a report around Embodied Carbon Policy Reduction Calculator, and you can find it here on our webpage. We'll be sending the links after. Next slide. So the project goals was really to establish a way for planners and policymakers to model the carbon savings of different policies around embodied carbon for their specific city. And so we wanted to allow for comparison of reduction policies for embodied carbon by key target dates that we've heard, 2030, 2050, to really ask what is the largest impact for my city. And here another goal was providing customized estimates of carbon savings associated with each of the different policies, and then to evaluate and prioritize policies that may be required to meet embodied carbon targets like we've talked about today that you've seen in the climate action plans. And in the next slide, I have just a quick snapshot of the 4 different policy areas that you can find in this report that we looked at. And one is reducing the embodied carbon footprint of entire buildings. 2, limiting the embodied carbon footprint of concrete specifically. 3, increasing adaptive reuse. And 4, evaluating the carbon impact of housing policy. So the next slide, you can see one example of a city that we actually worked with. And this was New York City. And you can see that the building embodied carbon intensity reduction requirements actually presented the largest opportunity for this city. And next was actually incentivizing adaptive reuse as the second largest opportunity. And they also had a recommendation to look at multifamily residential around embodied carbon and policy. So I just wanted to share that tool with you. If you are interested, send us an email and we can send it to you. And yeah, would recommend that you read the report and check it out and see how you can apply this tool in your city. Next slide, please. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Webley.
Thanks, Megan. My name is Webley Bowles. I'm Associate Director at Codes and Policy at New Buildings Institute. I actually live in Portland, and so I'm really proud of the work that our city has made around embodied carbon. You've likely heard my introduction before. I've had the pleasure of working with this great group a couple of times. I'm a licensed architect with 20 years experience working in design, sustainable consulting, policy, and advocacy. Let's get into it. Next slide. You're likely familiar with New Buildings Institute as well. We're a national nonprofit, and we look at different strategies around decarbonization. You can see our 5 foundations of zero carbon building policies on the left-hand side, with life cycle impacts there at the end, which obviously circles back around because it's incorporated into everything. We also have a few resources around embodied carbon in the building code, and I'll talk about an upcoming resource today, which includes open source embodied carbon code language, which I know there was a question about this in the chat. So this is for you, Kate. So climate actions are really important, and they really set the path for all future work. So if you want to go to the next slide. Thank you. As we've discussed, this is kind of the foundation of what we want to do here to make sure that these goals are really set. So what we want to do, since I work primarily within the building code, I want to show you how important that setting these goals in the climate action plan is to get to that code. So these goals can help set justification for legislation. That can be procurement, requiring code updates, deconstruction policies, pilot projects, other such things. So those goals and zoning codes can also help us lead to changing new construction through the building code. So next slide. And I'll also say that the importance of getting to updating the building code is that it requires that all new construction projects use low carbon products, and that illustrates to the market demand and provides the insurance that manufacturers need that these changes are permanent and the work that they are working on to lower the carbon of their products will be successful because there's demand for it. So as Rebecca noted, there's several important areas to incorporate embodied carbon within climate action plans. The local production, she went through a lot of these, so I think we don't need to spend too much time here. And Megan provided some great examples of what's happening in Portland with the technical assistance for end-of-life considerations, our deconstruction policy. One thing I will note here that I think can be overmissed is the importance of incorporating these to create jobs. So there was a little bit of discussion around workforce training. In Portland, there's a company called Sankofa, and their work is really only possible because of the climate action plan and the deconstruction policy, and then the state building code allowing building product reuse for wood. And so without those policy and code, Sankofa would not really be a business. So it's important to look at the positive unintended consequences of this and how it can lead to more business. And that's what we want to get at. We want to drive economies around low carbon building products. So next slide. So when creating buy clean legislation, jurisdictions can incorporate requirements for the code development agency, whatever that happens to be in your jurisdiction, to adopt embodied carbon code language. And jurisdictions can lead by example through those by clean policies, but also set a date where the requirements for the building code can be incorporated. So MBI is creating template legislation to support incorporation along with procurement policies, or it could be standalone. So on the right-hand side, that authority of building code there, it points directly to the embodied carbon building code that MBI is working on and will be publishing within the next month. And it says either adopt this or something equivalent to that. So this provides kind of that chain of setting that goal, adopting legislation, getting to the building code where all buildings will need to address these lower carbon requirements. Next slide. So whether using a whole building LCA approach or a products approach for low embodied carbon products, there's a few items that should be spelled out, like the scope, the global warming potential metric, the exceptions, and what reporting will actually look like. This could be done within that legislation, depending on the jurisdiction and how they want to structure things, or this is something that could be developed within the rulemaking process. The requirements for the embodied carbon limits for products or for a full building can go through the building code or the zoning code, depending on your jurisdiction and how things work there. But you do need to identify the scope, metrics, etc., exceptions, etc. Next slide. So this slide is not intended to put you to sleep, but this is to show you that we have embodied carbon building code language for about 40 different products. This would address specifically new construction. And this language helps to align the way that the code is written with the way that the PCRs, the product category rules, that is a language that goes into the EPDs. So the items that you see here in red show how these items can be changed to be a little bit more flexible depending on your location. So in this example of glazing, it's showing that 50% of flat glass that's used in windows, so it's specifically calling out where this product is being used, and it's setting a global warming potential limit, or a kilogram CO2e per metric ton, at 150% of the industry average. So that could be kind of kept as is, or a specific number could be included in there. And you'll see here that it also includes exceptions. And it also includes documentation, specifically what the building code official wants to see and confirm how it's being applied. Next slide. So the Cal Green was brought up a couple of times. This is the 2022 Cal Green proposal, which is currently being considered. There are 3 different paths under one option. So that gray column that you see there that says existing voluntary, that's what is currently in Cal Green as voluntary. So what this proposal does is that it moves items into that mandatory column, and then we have different option for the tiers, which some jurisdictions will adopt. So in this case, this embodied carbon proposal has 3 different options. One is building reuse at the or whole building LCA, or the prescriptive approach. So a project would need to choose one of these to comply with. So if you go to the next one, we'll dive into a little bit more details here. This is a little bit more for reference. I do have a link down at the very bottom. Joy, I'm not sure if you are able to put that in the chat or not, but this it's when the next hearings are, if you're interested in being involved in it. So on the left-hand side, these are the requirements for the whole building LCA. And then on the right-hand side is the prescriptive requirements. I've left out the requirements for building reuse. This is where I get most of the questions about what's happening with Cal Green. So whole building LCA, we're looking at cradle to grave and primarily looking at the structure and envelope. And this sets the requirements for the certification that the software must use, and that the global warming potential for the whole building LCA must be 10% better than the mandatory better to achieve the mandatory requirement. And that prescriptive approach is setting that GWP limit per the table. The table doesn't include concrete. That's on the next slide, which will which will be a reference for later. But the EPDs must be verified by the architect and provided to the owner. So the enforcing agency may require inspection, special inspection here. This will be part of what is heard at the next hearings and how the enforcement will actually happen. There's been some discussion that maybe this is better as a third-party review document to confirm compliance of it. So that's where we currently are with it. We will know more early August. The next slide shows the global warming potential requirements for the prescriptive approach. And I have these here just so they can be referenced later. You can see the products on the left-hand side. Those align with Buy Clean California. Concrete is added here. Concrete can be achieved in two different paths. One can be kind of a weighted average, which is that messy calculation that you see down there on the left for reference later, or each concrete strength can be achieved per that limit that you see there. And this is set, since this is the mandatory requirement, this is set at 175% of industry average, which ends up being about the 90th percentile. And the reason that this is so that more projects can comply. It's this entry level point into setting GWP limits per product. Next slide. So I'll leave you with this again. In California, we see that there's several climate action plans, include embodied carbon goals, like San Francisco, where they want to balance carbon and they have specific actions for it. That's really important. At the state level, there's Buy Clean California that really primes the market with the state showing that what is possible anyone can achieve. And then there's Cal Green, which is setting these requirements in building code across all new constructions. And this allows manufacturers to know that there is demand for this product there and that it will continue to be demand. So next slide. Thank you for your attention. You're welcome to contact me in the chat or after this event as well. So I'll hand it back to Joy.
Thank you so much, Webley, and thank you to all of our panelists for the time you spent with us today. We really appreciate it. I'm going to close by reiterating the steps that we identified at the beginning. If you'll go to the next slide, Julia, and for which each of our speakers gave us more details that you've just heard about. Our intention was to illustrate examples for each of these steps for including embodied carbon and climate action plans. Again, a reminder to look up your state and region's climate pollution reduction grant planning leads. Again, we'll post that link for you so you can find them. I'm just going to do a quick run through the next few slides. So we'll have time for questions and answers at the end of our conversation. This slide is just these are the EPA Region 9 and 10 agencies receiving state planning grants. And the next slide, these are the major metropolitan area grant lead agencies and areas covered in the West Coast regions. And plus, on the next slide, we have many agencies in California that are receiving metro area planning grants. And since the forum has participants from other parts of the country, again, we'll post that link to the full list of participating states and metro areas in the chat so that you can take a look and find your local entity. So the next slide is some helpful funding links to these and other EPA funding opportunities. And the grant pages often have recorded webinars that you may be interested in. We'll post these webinar slides to our website, and we'll also send them out following this webinar today so that you'll see them under the webinar tab, and we'll post the recording there as soon as it's available, so you'll have access to these links as well. The Forum Built Environment Work Group and the partners who spoke today are interested to talk with teams that are engaging in the climate pollution reduction grant planning phase to see what support they need in exploring embodied carbon as a climate action plan measure through these steps, please reach out to us or refer your regional or state leads to us, and we'd be happy to speak with them. So we're now going to turn our attention to the questions in the Q&A. We also encourage you to share what kind of support or resources you might need to explore this topic further. So I do see that we have 2 questions in the Q&A, and I know someone had raised their hand during the presentation as well, so we will get to you. But first, these first 2 questions came in while Rebecca was speaking. So Rebecca, you might be the one to answer these, and I know Webley addressed one of them as well. So the first question is, shouldn't the inclusion of actually mining the material in the wheelbarrow be in the calculation? This was when there was a slide up, Rebecca, that had a picture or an icon of a wheelbarrow. Julia, do you want to flip back and see if we can find that slide? Maybe it was that one.
I see a wheelbarrow. I'm not sure I understand what the question is. Maybe Katie can elaborate.
Yeah, Kate, since you had a few questions, do you want to raise your hand and Julia can find you and unmute you? There she is. Okay, Julia, can you find Kate and unmute her so she can speak?
Kate, I've asked to unmute you.
Yes.
There we go.
There you go.
There we go.
Thanks so much. I really was just asking, it starts there, the slide. However, really, the products in the wheelbarrow, what about the carbon to get it out of the ground, to mine it, to get it into the wheelbarrow? Was that included?
Yeah, totally. So that would be included within the official product stage of the life cycle. So this is talking about stages A1 through A3. So if you look at A1, that's with raw material extraction. So that would include mining and other activities that you need to actually get that virgin material out of the ground to then, make those bricks that are in the wheelbarrow.
Yeah, I figured it did, but it doesn't say it. So I just thought I'd ask to make sure if it was an oversight, because that's, we all know that now, that's really important. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
And Kate, your second question, I think Webley touched on it, but do you want to ask more about the discussion on how the local building code can address embodied carbon?
Yes, she definitely touched on it. I thank her for that. I took as many pictures as I could. I represent the county in New York. We don't have much say in anything, but I would love to share that with my villages and towns. I wonder if you either have any details or suggestions you could offer to, upstate will say, folks, this is not their priority. Where do you start? Do you start small, of course, but how do you start them thinking and adopting to change their code now? And then I'm going to ask you if you could send me language for the ones who didn't change their code, but I have a doubling of a town's municipality right now in front of me that it's going to be too late to change the code. But if there's strong suggestion language you have, I would love if you could forward that to me.
Yeah, Kate, I'm happy to share the draft that we currently have. In fact, it's out for public review right now, and it would be great to get your input on it if you're interested in that, or just use it. It will be available with a couple of edits in the near future. In terms of kind of where to start, so our code includes 40 products. That's a lot of products. Most people are starting with what we're seeing in Buy Clean, or they're starting with concrete and steel and looking at those 2 products first. And so that's what I would recommend. And yeah, I hear a lot from embodied carbon enthusiasts, myself included, that we should be starting at the industry average as the place that all products should meet the global warming potential of that industry average and nothing higher. In some jurisdictions, and each jurisdiction is going to know this on their own, kind of what percentage they need to start with. Is it going to be something that's pretty high, like what we're seeing in that mandatory requirement for Cal Green, where it's set at 175% of industry average, because we know that we need to make some progress and just collecting EPDs and making sure that they're not the highest amount of carbon for that concrete might be the place to start, depending on the jurisdiction and what products are available within the community.
Thanks, Webley.
And I was just going to add, Kate, I think you mentioned you were from New York State. New York State has a state BioClean, or it's not called BioClean. It's for procurement of low carbon concrete for state projects. So I think there's a strong argument for cities and jurisdictions and the state itself when addressing building codes to start with concrete as well, so that those two things are aligned.
Thanks, Rebecca. There was another, go ahead, Jordan.
Yeah, I was just going to say the last thing I'd add about just maybe communication style or messages when talking to different audiences is that, there's been some studies that, material conservation is more of sort of a universal message, regardless of what side of the political spectrum you are on. So that could be helpful in your talking points. And then also when we think about embodied carbon, if you want to focus a little less on greenhouse gas emissions and global warming and focus more on industrial efficiency and manufacturing efficiency, I think most people can relate to the message of energy efficiency. And really what we're talking about at some levels on embodied carbon is just more efficiently producing building materials. So I think people can relate to that across political spectrums as another messaging strategy.
Thanks, Jordan. And I wanted to note while Megan was presenting, Sarah Sutton raised her hand. Sarah, do you want to raise your hand again, and we can do the same thing like we did with Kate, unmute you and you can ask your question, or did your question get answered? Okay, I'm gonna move on, but Sarah, go ahead and raise your hand and we can come back to you if you still have a question. So in the Q&A, we have another question here from David Alloway from Oregon. He wants to thank the speakers for highlighting several case studies and resource documents suggesting a variety of policy options and actions. His question is, has anyone yet evaluated the effectiveness of these policies once actually implemented versus desktop studies of hypothetical theoretical potential? Or is it too early for that? And if no evaluation results are available yet, is somebody working on such evaluation, that is evaluating the impacts of new policies being implemented? You guys want to take turns on that one?
Yeah, I can start with that and then I'll pass it over to Jordan. So great. The CLF, we have this proxy internal prototype calculator that I mentioned with the embodied carbon policy reduction calculator, where we looked at 4 different cities and looked at different policies. So that was how we did it internally, and we're happy to share that resource. But yeah, there has been some jurisdictions who have done this analysis, and I'll pass it over to Jordan to talk a little bit about what Oregon did with their policy.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, the one study that I know of that I was involved with when I worked for the state of Oregon, that you're probably well aware of, David, is the one where we evaluated the effectiveness of Portland's deconstruction ordinance. And we looked at the first 40 homes that went through Portland's deconstruction program in partnership, of course, with the city of Portland to help them evaluate the effectiveness of their policy. And we found, yes, in fact, deconstructing homes did save more carbon than demolishing them and sending them to various other recovery pathways. And we also were able to evaluate the sort of relative benefits of that policy compared to other policies, like changing all the street lights in the city to LED from incandescents and things like that. And so that is probably the only policy that I'm aware of that's actually been evaluated from real data coming in. All of the Buy Clean sort of material focused policies that we're talking about are really so new. Even though, California has, passed theirs in 2017, they only started actually implementing it last year. City of Portland's concrete policy just started to be implemented in the beginning of this year. I'd say that we've seen a number of different case studies that this can be successful at a project scale. So you would think you'd be able to scale that up and see that success at a policy scale. I don't actually know of any other measured examples of policies on the ground that have been able to show success there, because we're still kind of early within this development timeline. I'll turn it over to anyone else on the panel that might have any other examples they want to list.
I can share that Portland's deconstruction policy is reducing waste by about 13%. And while that percentage might not seem like it's very large, it's still enough for there to be businesses that are built around it, and it's waste that's not going to the landfill. So I think understanding the effectiveness really requires putting it in context to understand what that means as a larger whole in the direction that a jurisdiction wants to take a policy.
Thanks, Webley. Thanks, Jordan. Okay, the next question is from Timothy. Thank you for the great presentations. Is there any work being done through the International Building Code process on embodied carbon?
Yeah, so Timothy, I'll take that question. So last cycle 2024, MBI did submit proposals to IBC for embodied carbon. The IBC chose not to move forward with it. ICC, which is the International Code Council, is currently working with ASHRAE on a standard, and that standard is called 240p. I'm forgetting the actual long title of it. If anyone else, I'll try to throw that in the chat. But they are looking at this, and it's going to be another couple years until that is public. We're not sure where that's going to go in the ICC suite of codes, but just to know that MBI is continuing to work with the IBC to incorporate embodied carbon requirements for individual products there.
Great, thanks, Webley. Okay, the next question is about the EPA's CPRG, which includes climate innovation teams. This seems like an innovative topic that should be included. Do you know if EPA will hold space for this topic? Is there anyone from EPA who wants to raise their hand to answer that question? Timothy has raised her hand. If Julie, if we can, there we go. Go ahead, Timothy.
Just to say that I'm not sure,
Okay.
but I'll make sure to share that request with the CPRG team.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay. The next question is from Cal Green. Different options to meet the EC requirements. What are you seeing as the predominant one? Why the building square foot threshold when making it mandatory is so high, 100,000 square feet?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So because it has not yet been adopted, we're not seeing any specific path that projects would want to take. We had originally proposed that this would be at a 50,000 square foot threshold because it would capture a large percentage of square footage, not necessarily the number of buildings. Through the code hearings, there was interest in moving that to a higher threshold, a higher square footage, so that there would be kind of a smaller number of projects that would go through, and that would allow testing, piloting, I guess you could say, of this process to make sure that it is working for the design teams and for the code officials. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a pilot. It would be in the building code, but that's kind of the intent there, is that it would impact a fewer number of projects.
Thanks. And there was a follow-up question, I think, to that. I'm not sure if you covered it. Are the current options also for 100,000 square feet?
Yes, the current proposals are 100,000 square feet,
Okay,
except
thank
for
you.
schools, because division of the state architect has jurisdiction over setting that threshold for the schools that's set at 50,000 square feet.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question is, could you explain more about the potential for emission reduction through material reuse as shown in the graphic with the different size green and yellow bubbles, I think from RMI. I was surprised to see reuse didn't seem to have larger potential impact, nor impact outside of private construction.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would defer to the report to really look into why that bubble appears so small in their report. I do think it's worth questioning that because, you know, I think we think about the potential for material reuse as being a pretty big opportunity. So I would just look into that report a little bit more, might tell you a little bit more about why it's ranked in that manner. But if you want sort of my take on material reuse, I think it is really hard to measure because materials, when they're reused, of course, there's tons of different materials and they're all used in very different ways. A lot of materials can't be reused in the same way that they were used originally. So they get sort of processed and used maybe for aggregate or for just a different, if it's recycled concrete, for instance, that concrete gets ground up and then is used for aggregate. It can't be used for structural concrete again. So that's an example of how some materials need to be just used in a different way once it's recovered and recycled. I think maybe other folks on the panel have opinions as well on different impacts of emissions reductions through material reuse, but I think it's just a complicated topic. So I do think it's kind of hard to know what that impact is, but we've seen, like Webley presented that excellent example of sort of a new businesses and new economies that have come up from this circularity idea of reusing building materials. And in theory, if those emissions potentials is small, you're getting so many benefits from doing a deconstruction program that it's really worth looking into. So I don't know if Jordan, Megan, or Webley have other sort of thoughts on material reuse and different impacts there.
Yeah, I'll chime in real briefly in that echoing Rebecca, some of the materials that have the highest carbon impacts are not set up very well for reuse, like concrete and steel. Those materials do not have clear reuse pathways. If you saw the analysis that we did around whole building reuse, when you're able to reuse an entire building rather than just the individual materials, you're going to have significantly greater impact reduction potential. Than doing it just at the material scale. And I don't know what the CNCA report modeled there. I think it was probably at the material scale rather than at the whole building scale. But again, I haven't looked at that report in a while. So that's one piece. Then the other piece, which you saw in the, this City of Portland deconstruction study that Megan referenced, is that, when you're talking about the residential sector, 90% of the materials you're getting out of there is wood. And it's absolutely 100% fantastic to reuse wood. But when you are offsetting the production of new wood, wood itself is not a high carbon material to produce. So some of the benefits associated with wood reuse get a little tricky and finicky in the carbon calculations, because in some cases you are allowing the continued sequestration of carbon within the wood materials that may have otherwise been released through another mechanism. So sometimes we could undervalue wood reuse through just the way you are calculating carbon. And I can't emphasize enough the point that Webley said, is that we kind of need to look at every strategy here, and reuse is one of these strategies that hits a lot of buckets all at once. Not only does it have carbon benefits, albeit sometimes small compared to other strategies, but it also has economic potential and social potential as well. So I think it's important to keep all three of those in mind.
Thanks. Anyone else want to chime in?
The only last thing I'll say is specifically on the West Coast, I think there's such a interest in reuse. I would actually recommend you go to All for Reuse website. They're actually tracking different educational programs, policies, regional like places where they're collecting reused materials. And so it's, yeah, there's a lot of interest here on the West Coast. And of course you can see with policies, but also businesses coming in, workforce development trainings like what we mentioned. So yeah, I'll just mention that resource as well.
Yeah, and I'll end this a little bit on a downer, unfortunately. We do need to consider which materials we are reusing. So if it is, and buildings, so if we're looking at something that has lead paint on it, we need to consider, is that a product to reuse? How is that being reclaimed in such a way that it's not hazardous? What about asbestos? How are we taking care of that? So reuse, not all reuse is good reuse, unfortunately. And I think I just wanted to add that additional layer into consideration around the complexity of reuse.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, the next question. Increasing demand for low carbon items might play out in two ways. One, industries reduce GHG emissions in order to compete. Two, existing low carbon products and high carbon products simply swap buyers. Pathway number one will result in reductions in GHG emissions. Pathway two simply shifts products around in the marketplace. Is there evidence that mandatory EPDs, building standards, etc., are resulting in actual reductions in emissions, pathway number one, as opposed to swapping buyers and sellers, as in pathway number two?
I'll take a first crack at that,
Jordan.
and then maybe others can chime in. I think my first take on it is that, is there evidence mandatory EPDs, building standards results in actual reductions in emissions as opposed to swapping buyers and sellers? I think in an economy-wide scale, yet right now, we are not far enough along in sort of the buy clean and or requirements through building code to see economy-wide reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from the industries that are being targeted. And that's simply because there is not enough demand yet, because we are in what is pathway, what did you call it? Pathway 2, where right now demand is being created and we are just shifting products around in the marketplace. One of the results of shifting products around in the marketplace and creating more demand, for instance, in the concrete market, is that we're seeing more short supplies of supplementary cementitious materials, which are one pathway to create low carbon concrete. So we're starting to see indicators that demand is rising high enough that we are doing more than just shifting materials. We are creating more demand than there is supply for some things. So I'd say we definitely are going to go through a phase of just shifting materials around. I think when we're through that phase, we may actually see some of the prices of these materials go up, because it will actually, cause shifts in production to occur, which then could cause more investment being needed in some of these larger industrial sectors. I think with the long view, there's a lot of governments that are signing on, countries that are signing on to the United Nations Industrial Decarbonization Initiative. And with the long view in mind, they are making commitments to purchase lower carbon materials that are defined as near zero materials in 2030 and beyond. So it's providing that market signal for some of these larger industries that you will have a guaranteed market for your low carbon materials. So it's time to invest now in some of these larger industrial upgrades to reduce materials at an economy-wide scale. So that's what I'm seeing now. And then I think the other thing, and more at a local level, again, we're seeing plenty of examples of how you can reduce impacts with EPDs at a project level. And we're also seeing, I think, at least in the areas that I've worked in, a lot more companies taking more aggressive steps to reduce the carbon of their products and advertise that and have it become sort of a platform for which they pitch their business. I also feel like that's a shift in the marketplace that we're seeing as a result in increased in demand. Anybody else want to chime in?
Jordan, I think you said it perfectly. we're seeing so many new players in this field, so many new products that are coming up that are seeking funding or are being funded and trying to scale up as quickly as possible because they see this demand. So while we might not be looking at the manufacturers that currently exist, we're looking at a lot new manufacturers coming on the market.
Thanks. Okay. I think we have time for a few more questions. The next one is, we have a lot of underutilized commercial space or vacant retail or office space, which could be optimized before we need to construct more buildings. Could this be a climate action strategy? You're nodding your head, both Rebecca and Webley.
Yes, please make it your climate action strategy. I forget who said it, but somebody said it, that the greenest building is the one that's already built. So that is awesome. And we do have tons of vacant commercial space now that we all do work from home.
Yeah, and Gensler, an architecture firm, not to plug them, but they have a new tool out. It's like an AI tool that will study a building to understand how it can be reused and if it's a good candidate specifically for multifamily housing. So right now, I think it's been used in San Francisco, and it was like 33% of the buildings that they looked at could be reused for housing, but on average, it's like, 20%.
Interesting. Thank you. Okay, the next one, we seem to be trying. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jordan.
Oh, I was going to say, and so yes, I agree with the other panelists, and I think you may all know better than I do. I think there are some jurisdictions that have made it easier from a code perspective to actually convert commercial structures into residential, whereas that's not actually easy to do in a lot of places. So it's one thing, it would be great to put something like that in your climate action plan, but there may be a few steps along the path to realizing that to actually make it possible. And so, yeah, absolutely great thing to list in the climate action plan.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is, we seem to be trying to do less bad, but I hear there are plant-based materials that can actually store carbon and do more good. What's needed for more of that? Regional economic development with our rural counterparts?
I can speak a little bit to this. At RMI, we're doing a lot of research into this now. There are tons of amazing plant-based carbon sequestering materials, and you can build buildings that are carbon storing, net zero or carbon storing right now, especially in the residential sector. Definitely regional economic development in agricultural areas where you're using agricultural waste product. Instead of burning it, you're turning it into construction materials. This is such a ripe opportunity to create a lot of new jobs, new economies, and for buildings to be climate assets instead of climate problems. One way, strategy-wise, you can promote this in terms of building design is by trying to support the whole building life cycle assessment, which is really looking at embodied carbon per square foot or square meter of a building. And that allows for these materials to really shine. So right now we're seeing a lot of policies, like you say, on trying to do less bad, where you're looking at specific materials like concrete, steel, and glass, and other high emitting materials, and you're saying, let's look at these and try to get the emissions down from these particular materials. If you zoom out and look at the whole project or whole building, and you conduct these whole building life cycle assessments, that allows for the sort of swapping out of, maybe instead of concrete and steel in a building, you're using timber, or instead of like high impact insulation, you're using carbon sequestering insulation. So it's a way of measuring and a way of tracking and a way of regulating embodied carbon emissions that kind of supports the use of these, what you might call now alternative materials. I wish they weren't alternative, but it kind of supports these, like, yeah, alternative carbon storing materials. Anyone else want to add to that?
Sounds like we're all set, and we've run up against the end of our time for this webinar. So I think we'll end it there, but I just want to say thank you again to all of our panelists for all of your time and all of the great information you have shared. And we will be getting the slides out to folks who registered, and we will also get the slides and the recording posted to our website, and we'll get that information out to everybody. And I put my email in the chat if folks are interested in joining this work group for further work down the road. Please reach out and we'll make sure we get you added to our communication list. So with that, thank you so much for joining, and take care, everyone.